at the end of the day, they're using a lot of the same tools that your IT admins are going to use, right? And they're using the same accounts. And that's why, this might not be a fair comparison, but typically when I hear people talking about attacks and they're saying, oh, the attackers always create new accounts. I've done over 1,000 investigations over the course of probably 13 years doing incident response. But what I found there is in almost every single case, the attacker has used an existing account to accomplish what they need. They might create some accounts here or there, but I don't see that as a typical playbook. It certainly happens, but their goal is to find an existing account because they can just blend in, right? And that's all they need to do. They're literally just using the systems against the company to accomplish their goal.
Mobile workforces, cloud applications, and digitalization are changing every aspect of the modern enterprise. And with radical transformation come new business risks. Welcome to Hybrid Identity Protection, the premier podcast for cybersecurity pros charged with defending hybrid identity environments. Presented by Semperis, the pioneers of identity-driven cyber resilience for the hybrid enterprise. And now, here's your host, 15-time Microsoft MVP and Active Directory security expert, Sean Dubey.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the HIP Podcast. Speaking of the HIP conference, registration is now open for this year's HIP Global event. Join us at the Microsoft Conference Center in New York City, August 23rd and 24th, and hear from AD and identity security experts, including Microsoft Vice President of Identity Security, Alex Weinert, and former CIA Director and Semperis Strategic Advisor, General David Petraeus. You can learn more and register for HIP Global at the link in our podcast description. As organizations grapple with building, testing, and maintaining their incident response policies, processes, and teams, an important aspect that's often not well understood is cyber insurance. And even if you think you understand it, your knowledge may be out of date because the industry itself is evolving and maturing as it encounters new claims from incidents every day. My guest today is Jason Rebholz. Jason is Chief Information Security Officer for Corvus Insurance, which specializes in our topic. He's also known as the TeachMeCyber guy, with his own TeachMeCyber YouTube channel that focuses on the ins and outs of cybersecurity. Welcome, Jason.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
Before we dive into the cyber insurance topic, and we've discovered we have a lot to talk about there, first, why don't you tell us a little about your whole TeachMeCyber mission? You have a YouTube channel, and I know you speak independently on it about cybersecurity education.
Yeah, it's really the culmination of my career. I grew up in incident response, and I found myself in the position where I was describing very technical things to less technical audiences. And I literally just one day reached a point where I was reading some articles online, and I realized no one is going to understand this. It's going. These companies are basically writing towards a very small portion of an audience that is interested in cybersecurity, and so I felt that I had a superpower of being able to translate these technical topics into something that somebody who's less technical can understand. And so I just started it, and I just started testing. I started off on LinkedIn, just posting every day of just various security topics, and that naturally morphed into a YouTube channel, and have been doing it ever since.
Well, I know I have friends that they themselves or their children are looking to get into cybersecurity, and I tell them about the industry's negative unemployment rate, and that there are many ways to learn. But this looks like this is another great aspect of it. You got almost 50 videos out there, so that's really great.
Yeah, exactly. I'm a fan of the drip methodology of knowledge and learning. Is just a steady supply over time in small bites will resonate a little bit more than just trying to go in for the PhD right off the bat.
Right, and it'll stick a little bit longer too.
Exactly.
So for the topic of cyber insurance, let's start from the beginning. And by the beginning, I'm sort of thinking of the NIST cybersecurity framework, the attack framework, before, during, and after an attack.
Mm-hmm.
So beforehand, let's talk about the basics. Like what does it take to even get cyber insurance? What level of what I would call security maturity are you likely to need before you can even get insurance?
Yeah, it's going to be the classic security answer of it depends,
Hmm.
right? But it's accurate because I think as everyone who knows security would say, your requirements for security are going to change depending on a lot of factors. Your industry, the size of your organization, your security budget, and so I think if you look at overall at cyber insurance, there is a very it's a very disparate way of trying to understand the risk, but there is some semblance of logic to the madness. So, when we look at things like the SMB space, small businesses, we're not going to expect that you're going to have $1 million budget for security, and so we're not expecting the Rolls Royce of security in your organization. But
Mm-hmm.
what I do find is that regardless of the size of your organization or the industry, there's really a few key technologies that you're going to find any cyber insurance carrier looking at. And so that comes down to number one, multi-factor authentication. Are you securing your access to email and any remote access into your environment with MFA? Number two is endpoint detection and response, right? Really advanced endpoint security. And the reason for that is it's effective at identifying malware, blocking malware. Not perfect, but it's effective in helping just identify issues early on, and can help stem the overall severity or the impact of an incident. And then third, it comes down to the ransomware impact. And so we're looking at backups. Do you have robust, secure, and resilient backups in your environment? And when you can get those right, you're typically positioning yourself fairly well. And there's always some nuance and different color that has to be added there. But that really tends to be a lot of the core of what cyber insurance is looking for.
Right. So it isn't, you don't expect a small business to be ISO 27001 compliant, but you expect them to have these security basics in place.
Exactly. And a good example of this, when we look at email security, right? This is one I didn't mention before, but when we're looking at that, your SMB customer or SMB company, they might just have the built-in email security that a Google or a Microsoft is going to provide. And in some cases, that's good enough, right? Especially if they're paying for an advanced license and get some of the advanced features. But as you start to mature as a company, there's just an expectation that, hey, you have a larger attack footprint. And so there's an expectation that you're going to be able to invest more dollars into trying to protect that. And so you might look to see, do they have more advanced and email security features, link scanning, attachment scanning, things of that nature. And so that's how things are going to change as your revenue as a company increases. There are just going to be more requirements that get added into that.
So what would you then, and maybe this is an extension of my previous question, what do applicants often get wrong when they're applying for insurance?
So I think one of the things is that they think it's a one-way street of information, right? Where, hey, we can't ask questions because we don't want to draw attention, and so I think that's the most important thing is you have to look at cyber insurance as a partner. And one of the worst things you can do is just go in, fill out the questionnaire, and if you're confused by a question or there's some context that you want to add, the worst thing you can do is not say it or not ask the question, right? And so I love when I see somebody who's looking at insurance, at buying insurance, coming in and saying, hey, I want to give you more context on what we're doing. Right. And so what you'll find is that a lot of cyber insurance applications are yes, no questions. And anyone that has done security knows that a lot of security is not just a yes, no question. There's just certain things that you want to be able to explain. And so I always tell people, use the space in the margin on these applications, add in that additional flavor. And so the point of this is you can go to cyber insurance and have a conversation, ask for clarification. Hey, what do you mean by this question? Because I always just find that there's a lot of confusion that comes into place where, people just aren't on the same page of what's being asked and what's expected of me for that response.
That resonates so strongly because I have answered a lot of security questionnaires for prospects and for customers, and they're they're almost always Boolean, yes or no.
Hmm.
Do you have hard disk encryption?
Hmm.
Yes ish. There, yeah, but you're right. And then you try to give more context to say, because the reality is, and you and I understand this, is look, so there is a particular area that may not be, due to whatever its nature, may not be as secured, but the risk associated with it because of X, Y, and Z is exceedingly low.
Hmm.
So not everybody has all the money for everything all the time. So what you're saying essentially is give the reviewer context so they can better understand it. Don't just say yes, and then if something bad happens, they have no context.
Exactly. And to your point, right? Risk is different for every organization. So, the absence of a control in one company might be more devastating than that same control missing in another, right? But for the underwriters that are looking at these files, they may not have that context to understand why. And so it's not just this thing where, oh, you don't have it, great, like you're done sort of thing. There is always an opportunity for a conversation to happen to get that context there. And I would say, with that, it's not a search for perfection, right? Like the goal is not to get to 100% on the cyber insurance application test, right? What I typically find is the people who come in the strongest saying, yeah, we have all the controls, we're not going to get hacked, we're fine. Like those are the ones that scare me the most, because there's just a misalignment to the reality of cybersecurity that, your controls will fail. An attacker will find a way to bypass them, and it might not be your fault, and maybe it is your fault. It doesn't really matter to me, right? The point of cyber insurance is to address the large scale issues that will happen when a cyber event happens, right? It's somebody got into our systems and they just blew it up, right? And so we want you to be able to handle the day-to-day things. We had an alert on our system, got to investigate. But cyber insurance exists because we understand that you're not going to bat 1,000% here, but how can we just give you that backstop so that if something does fail and some mistakes happen along the way, that you have that financial backstop to get back to where you were before.
When you're in an incident, time is of the essence, but I think people don't realize or prepare for how long a cyber insurance company may require and how that impacts the response timeline. So, what is a typical timeline for cyber insurance during incident response, or what typically happens? How might the insurance company's requirement impact the speed of the recovery effort?
Yeah, so this really comes down to understanding your insurance policy, right? So, as for any CISO, typically what I find is that they, and even if it's just an IT expert, right? It's anyone who's on the hook for securing the
Right.
organization or responsible for the IT operations. Typically, their role in cyber insurance is fill out the application, and then that's it, right? And so the first step here is understand what's required of your cyber insurance carrier, because some cyber insurance policies will mandate that you use their vendors to do the incident response engagement, right? And so I've seen this before where somebody didn't know that. And having done IR in the past, I've been a victim of this as a service provider, where we start doing an IR and it turns out that we weren't on whatever the list was, and we had to stand down, right? And so that can be disruptive, because now you have to stop, and then you're starting with somebody else. So if you understand what the rules of engagement are beforehand, it makes for an easier response process. Now, with that, there are certain things that help just move everything along, right? And I think there can sometimes be this perception that, oh, we have to go and we have to get approval from our insurance carrier to proceed, right? And so when the system works the way it's intended, you're notifying your insurance carrier, hey, I got hacked. There's a situation on the ground. How can I go about doing this, right? And at that point, they can get you introduced to different vendors, right? An incident response vendor, privacy counsel to help you, understand what are your legal obligations or your legal risks. If you need help with a ransom negotiation, right, they can pull people in there. And so what I find is that it actually helps speed up the recovery process or the response process, because these insurance carriers, like, we're dealing with this every single day. We know all the key players, and so we can really help expedite the response effort. Typically, what I see is that come Monday, if the incident happened on Monday, sometimes what will happen is that organization will try to respond to it themselves. See, oh, should we do the investigation? How do we try to respond to this? And then come Friday, it just becomes an inbound Friday. That's what I used to call it when I was doing incident response. And suddenly, like, everybody's like, oh, the weekend's here. I think I need help with responding to this. And then they'll call their insurance carrier and say, hey, we have an issue. What can we do? And that's when we'll pull in all the right people. And so I would say I see more time lost with organizations that aren't familiar with the incident response process itself. And why should they be? Like, hopefully they're only going through this once every, a century if in a perfect world. But, it's acknowledge that, hey, I'm not an incident response expert as a company. My insurance carrier knows all the key players. I can work with them right off the bat and then just get straight to responding. And in a perfect world, you can get this done in a matter of hours, right? There's no slowdown. It's just action right away.
I know our people have experienced that Happy Friday situation before. It's like, what?
Many a weekend have been ruined in incident response.
Oh, so what you're saying is essentially is your carrier can assist you with all of these aspects, because there are many threads that are going on simultaneously. There's, the actual responders, there's the organization, there's the timeline tracking, there's the negotiations, there are many threads. And what you're saying is that your insurance company can actually help you with those rather than hinder you.
Exactly. And that one of the first calls that you're having is with somebody on the claims team, and they'll go through and say, okay, this is your policy. This is what's covered. We're going to get you an incident response firm, somebody who can do forensics. We're going to get you privacy counsel. And it really just helps understand what are the pieces on the incident response field that I have at my disposal, and how do I move those around? Like, it really becomes somebody that can facilitate the resolution of this, hopefully a once in a career type issue here of having an incident.
Well, and I will flip that on its side and say, when you as an organization, not you, Jason, but when the listener is is looking at cyber insurance carriers, those are the questions to be asking them. Will you help us with this? Will you help us with that? Do we have resources for all of these things, or must we figure it out ourselves?
Exactly. And that's part of the incident response planning, right? It's in the incident response plans that I write, I have the contact information for my insurance carrier. Right. And I know all of the different forensics firms that I have available to me. I know all of the different privacy counsel firms that are available for me. And so you're just planning ahead to understand what are the levers that I have to pull so I can be as efficient as possible in that response process.
Does the insurance company get directly involved in threat actor negotiations, or do they leave it to a third party? Because that's directly impacts their bottom line, what the size of the claim is.
Yeah, it's always through a third party. I think there's a misconception where cyber insurance is uniquely tied into every facet of the response process, and it's just not the case. We're here to help you understand what your coverage is. We're here to help get you the right people for the right job. And help facilitate that through and through. And so, what you find is, and I'll put my incident response hat back on here where I was a service provider. Once that introduction was made, it was go time. And it was, as an incident response provider, you are working directly with that client who was hacked and working in their best interest to get things moving along. And so cyber insurance, I almost look at it as they're kind of sitting above the fold, and helping be that financial backstop, and just helping the business understand, hey, if you do X, Y, and Z, yep, that's going to be covered. But if you go down this route, that may not be covered, right? And it's the same thing with car insurance, right? I'll say this, right, for me, right? I bought car insurance. I haven't looked at that probably since I bought it, years and years and years ago. I couldn't tell you what was covered offhand, right? And so that's on me. if I get into a car accident tomorrow, I'm going to be asking these questions of like, oh, gee, what am I on the hook for, right? Am I allowed to get a rental car? Am I getting reimbursed? Like, there's a lot of confusion that happens there in the incident response cycle, just like with a car accident. So, like, if you can get ahead of that, understand what's there, what's available to you, it just makes it such a smoother process. And with that car, I'm there. I bought insurance to get the value of my car reimbursed. I'm not going to go from like a Ford Focus to buying a Ferrari. And I think like that's where a lot of the confusion comes in place with cyber insurance.
I had that analogy resonating with me as well. I live in North Texas. And so since we've just been through the spring is coming, it means it's time for a new roof. We had ping pong ball sized hail about 6 weeks ago here. So that means a new roof, new gutters. This will be our fourth roof in a little less than 20 years or about 20 years.
Oh my gosh.
So we don't really have to worry about 30-year roofs in North Texas, but it's this, but to your point or what we're talking about, my insurance provider is like, great, here's who we recommend. Here are the things, here's, a well set up insurance provider is designed to make it easier for you, not harder for you.
Exactly. And you might be an expert on roofing now, having had to replace your roof that many times. But, for me, like I've only ever had to replace a roof once. And I didn't have to go through insurance for that. But that was a scenario where like, I don't know the first thing about roofing, nor do I care to learn more about roofing. Right. And so it's just, I am looking for somebody that knows that world. And, I'm looking for somebody that doesn't have, they don't necessarily like have a bias against me, right? And like for cyber insurance in particular, like you are never going to find somebody who has a vested interest as much of a cyber insurance carrier in your situation, right? And so I think this is like a lot of people tried to alienate cyber insurance. Oh, like they're just there to try to cut the costs and everything like that. And it's like no. We're here to help advise you on all of the things that we have seen go very well and all the things that we've seen go very badly. And that end result is what is the most effective response process possible? Not what the most cost effective, what is the most effective period? And that's not necessarily what a policyholder might want to hear, right? Because I go back to my recovery days. A lot of people, they're saying, well, the only way we can get back up and running is to completely rebuild our environment. And so, I would pause there. And this is when I was a service provider, not as a cyber insurance carrier. And I would say, yeah, you could go down that way, but you're going to be spending $2 million. You're going to extend your outage by, maybe 4 to 6 weeks. Or we could go and get you back up and running in a couple of days and you'll be, good to go. And so that's the type of conversations that happen where it's like, this is not about, you don't have to go, again, the Cadillac version here. How do you get back up and running in the most efficient manner possible?
Right. And have had the opportunity to talk to various factors in incident response teams. And what I'm hearing more and more is, look, we've been involved in a lot of these. You've not been involved in, hopefully, any of these. So listen to our advice rather than trying to figure it out yourself.
Exactly. You don't have to go at it alone.
Recognizing that there's a range in this, about how long does it take for a claim to be approved and reimbursed?
So it's really going to be dependent on every engagement. Some of them are pretty straightforward, and so as the invoices come in, insurance carriers can turn that around fairly quickly. Sometimes they have to wait to understand more of the scenario. So it's purely dependent on the specifics of each engagement.
Okay. So to turn this to a little bit more of the identity aspect of this, because certainly, and anyone that's heard me talk about this, and I love to quote Alex Weinert, Microsoft. He's the vice president for Microsoft Identity Security, saying that more often than not, ransomware attacks are the second phase of a campaign, and the first phase is an identity compromise. So about identity and in and how it relates to ransomware? I know you've been doing some thinking on that recently.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating change in ransomware, and this is something I was going to say I had the fortune of seeing ransomware evolve, but I don't think it was much of a fortune. It was painful, but I've seen ransomware where it's gone from single system encryption to what I always call the enterprise encryption. So that's where they're getting in and they're just encrypting every single system in your environment. And those were the days where the first group to do this was this group called SamSam, and they get in, typically would encrypt all the servers, and then it was a $50,000 ransom. And I remember at that time when a typical ransom was about like $4,000 or $5,000. The first time I saw it, I was like, "Oh man, $50,000! That's crazy!" And now I'm like wishing we could go back there because now you're dealing with $1 million ransoms. Average ransom demands hundreds of thousands of dollars that are actually getting paid out. And so, what I found in this evolution was it started where these ransomware groups were doing it all themselves, and so they would either they love to brute force RDP, find a weak username and password combination,
hammer it.
Exactly. You'd see some of the phishing emails come in. And so that was the most popular way. And they would do this all themselves. But then once ransomware started taking off, it became an industry. And you started specialization take hold. And what happened there was you had this emergence of identity access brokers, right? And so these access brokers existed to try to figure out, who could I work with to try to get access into these companies, whether that is through, the methods we just talked about, or, throw in some vulnerabilities into the mix as well. But it would figure out how do we get access into that environment, and then how do we sell that to another group, like a ransomware actor, so that they can just cut that beginning out and just focus on moving around the environment. And so I don't know who had this quote, but I love it. Where it's, hackers don't hack in, they log in, right? And I think this is a scenario where, there's hacking is going to involve all these different things, but at the end of the day, the attackers are just trying to find the account in the environment that is going to give them the most possible access that they can get, right? And typically, domain administrator, any type of administrative credentials here. That's what they're going for. And that is what is enabling them to conduct their mission, whether that's going to be stealing data, encrypting systems and data, or both of them. And that's it. And so really, like, that identity is the most important thing. It's like all things lead back to the identity in these types of attacks. And I think, you take that forward, it's just that is going to be the future of attacks. It's been the history, and it's certainly going to continue to be in the future.
Yeah, it certainly... when I look through SC Magazine reports, or wherever, Bleeping Computer, when they're talking about incidents and companies being hit, and they rarely say the words Active Directory directly, but they do hint around it, and they talk about they may talk about domain controllers, they may talk about domain access, or they talk about network shares, or they're going through identity because that's the easiest route to get to what they want to get to.
Well, exactly, right. And I used to tell people when I was doing incident response, it was like, by the end of these engagements, the attacker is going to know your environment better than you do, right? Because at the end of the day, they're using a lot of the same tools that your IT admins are going to use, right? And they're using the same accounts. And that's why, this might not be a fair comparison, but typically when I hear people talking about attacks and they're saying, the attackers always create new accounts. I've done over 1,000 investigations over the course of probably 13 years doing incident response. But what I found there is in almost every single case, the attacker has used an existing account to accomplish what they need. They might create some accounts here or there, but I don't see that as a typical playbook. It certainly happens. But their goal is to find an existing account because they can just blend in, right? And that's all they need to do. They're literally just using the systems against the company to accomplish their goal.
If you look at and always refocus on the attacker's goals, their goals aren't necessarily to use some new and novel technique that'll get them publicity in Bleeping Computer or CISO or wherever. Their goal is to exfiltrate the data. That's not their goal. Their goal is to make as much money in as short a period of time as possible. And you can extrapolate or interpolate, if I go backwards, you can all of their actions, also just about from that process, if you remove morality from it.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think it's just very interesting to me because I've done investigations into various threat actors, and if you understand the motivations of the threat groups, it just helps you understand what the impact is, right? When I was doing investigations into nation state threats, their goal was to break in, steal that data for their own purposes, for their country, right? And so, you go back to Chinese APT threat actors, you could map the targets based on China's 5-year plan. Like all the industries that they said were important for them for the next 5 years, well, magically, those were the companies and the industries that were getting hit in these nation state attacks. I think with ransomware, right, to your point, it's how do I get to profit as quickly as possible, right? And so that's where you can see the iterations they're doing and how they're experimenting with how do we get more leverage. As we saw with the cyber insurance side, when we started mandating secure backups, we saw a 36% decline in the number of ransoms that were paid, right? And so for the threat actors, when they're starting to see, hey, encryption is no longer working in of itself, we have to adapt. And so you start seeing a spike in data theft included in this, right? So it's another leverage point for it. And so it's this constant iteration, but the motive doesn't change. It's, I want to make as much money as possible, as quickly as possible, and try to evade law enforcement as long as possible with that.
Right, and you're right. Everything comes back from that. So the attacking of critical infrastructure, because they'll get paid faster. There's going to be less ransom negotiations because they have to be up faster. It all comes back from that. Well, this was great, Jason. I really appreciate the insight that you provide into the cyber insurance world and their expectations and how a good cyber insurance provider can actually assist you in that most difficult, what I call the most stressful time of an IT pro's career, incident response. Thanks very much for your time and your insight.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us on the Hybrid Identity Protection Podcast with Sean Dubey. Be sure to subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you like to listen. Visit hipconf.com, that's HIPCONF.com, to learn about upcoming events, view expert presentations, and take part in the conversation.